Alright, so confession time. When I started this particular series, this being the Remaining Lords sort of sub-series, I had the Vampire Coast exclusively in mind. They have quite a few named characters left, sorta, and more on that in a minute. What they do have left is super cool. Unlike with the Tomb Kings, they have enough unit options left for us to do pairings, and so I'll touch upon each lord as I get along with any of those pairings. Now, I said they have a few characters left, however, I'm including both Dreadfleet and Grand Alliance characters. For reference's sake, Dreadfleet represented almost all of the characters in the original representation of the Vampire Coast, with the sole exception of Araness Assaultspite, who was actually a Grand Alliance character. For the latter, those being the Grand Alliance, pairing them into the Vampirates makes no sense whatsoever, so I would suggest that they instead use their original faction's roster, but I'm going to include them in this list for thematic reasons. I'm actually going to go to try and pair everyone for a rivalry up, one by one for added entertainment as well. And then last up, I would take Araness Assaultspite from the Vampire Coast and move her over to the Grand Alliance, because her commanding vampires and whatnot really doesn't make any sense for her lore. Anyways, that's enough tiptoeing around it though. Grab a big old glass of rum and let's get right into it. Let's start with one of the easiest ones to implement, and the one I'm sure most of you have already heard of. Vangheist. Vangheist is basically a direct clone of Pirates of the Caribbean. He and his crew were hired by a light mage named Albertus von Zeyck to kill a flame worm way out in the Sea of Claws. The duplicitous Vangheist eventually found out, however, that the flameworm's lair possessed the secret to eternal life. After numerous setbacks, they eventually did manage to track down and kill the flameworm, but as the light mage ordered them back to port, Vangheist betrayed and murdered him, and instead sought out immortality rather than the gold he was promised. Too late, unfortunately, Vangheist realized that the chaos-created immortality he sought was not what he was hoping to receive, and the ship came back to the mortal plane rotted and devoid of life. The entire crew, Vangheist included, turned to ghosts. Renaming his vessel the Shade Wraith, he now simply causes misery and fear wherever he can, devoid of any other purpose. In battle, Vangheist would be an ethereal ranged combatant, a niche that's completely unoccupied by any other lord in the entire game. His objective would be to track down the flameworm once again, and finally gain the proper immortality he and his crew are owed. For his new units and the like, obviously they're going to be themed around being ghosts, and the first thing I would add in would be Siren Hero units, to give it a buffing ethereal hero option. Beyond that, ghost crew and variants could slot in as low tier infantry, who would be far more durable than zombie deckhands against physical, but of course who would dissolve in seconds against magic or flaming attacks. Lastly, I'd put the Marshlights in as a mid-tier ethereal infantry with regeneration and melee, which would make them a devastatingly potent tar pit unit. Full disclosure, Marshlights are actually a Musillon unit, but we know he's big, borrow a steel, whatever we need. We are the pirates after all. His vessel, the Shade Wraith, could be used to cause fear map-wide with an activated ability, or to increase the speed of squads within an area with a second activated ability. Additionally, his first mate, Rotten Einrich, could be a tech-unlocked hero, which could add some diversity. So Vangheist could be our Dreadfleet half of the Lord Pack, and our Grand Alliance representative would be the Golden Magus. While Vangheist sacrificed guaranteed riches for the false promise of eternal life, the Golden Magus is already rich beyond measure, and already seems to be immune to the effects of aging. His past remains impossible to confirm, with some thinking him a former patriarch of the College of Magic, the reincarnation of the Gilded King of Coffer, or perhaps simply an eccentric merchant prince. In truth, however, his tale is far darker, as he's actually a devotee of Tzeentch, and beneath the beauty of his ship, his style, and his serfs, hides a brig of captured soldiers, the soul of a killer, and crippled slaves. None of his allies know of this, of course, nor does anyone else still living, which makes the Golden Magus a tremendously powerful ally, so long as his objectives and your own remain aligned. In battle, the Golden Magus would be a caster lord, still capable of handling weaker infantry and melee, but far better served by hanging back and launching spells and summons at the enemies. His campaign would involve opening and controlling all three royal djinns to become the most powerful entity in the world. For most of his roster, it would be plucked straight from the Empire's roster, with ogres being a noteworthy addition. For his new units, they would all be djinn, with sea nymphs being a debuffing melee unit with frostbite, Tempest Djinn being a flying harasser unit, and Fire Afrits being a single entity flying infantry blender. His ship, the Flaming Scimitar, could summon those very same djinn into battle into any position on the battlefield. But you've probably heard of the previous two characters. I mean, heck, they're both in mods at this point in time. How about some characters you probably haven't heard of, starting with Tordrek Hackhart. Before his fall to madness, he was rival to another dwarf engineer, that being Red Brokk. Try as he might, Tordrek has always left his second place to Brokk despite his talents with submersible craft, something which constantly troubled him. Eventually Tordrek would unsuccessfully attempt to eliminate his rival forever by using a steam-powered rivet claw on him. While his rival recovered from the attack, Tordrek was exiled, but fled Barrack to his Black Kraken before he could face retribution. His escape wasn't easy, as he had to fight through Merworms, Behemoth, and even a Triton Lord, before eventually ending up at the port of Zulgazar, the main port for the Chaos Dwarves. Here he planned, gathered followers, and built upon his creation even further, forcing the soul of a demon deep into his already terrifying monstrosity. Siding with Noctilus to ensure his chance at revenge, he now sails hoping to kill Red Brokk and prove himself the superior engineer once and for all. His campaign, of course, would be all about returning to Barrack to kill Red Brokk, but also needing to stay hidden from his enemy in his default move stance. In battle, Tordrek Hackhart would be a fairly slow, long-range sniper of a lord, almost akin to a gunnery wight. For his roster, assuming he comes in Game 3, we'd pretty much just pluck it straight from the Chaos Dwarves. While there's nothing in the lore about Chaos Dwarf-themed pirates, it would be tremendously easy for CA to add in a couple of those units, as well as some variants with the aquatic trait. As for his ship, the Black Kraken, I've struggled with it more than almost anything else on this list because it just really doesn't have a battlefield effect that would make sense on its own normally. It's a submarine, and a melee one at that. One option I could see would be to give it a possession mechanic, where you can effectively select a squad who will then get bonus melee attack, damage, and the unbreakable trait, but they will take continuous damage while the ability remains active. So his rival is blatantly obvious, then we literally just spoke about him. Brokk Gunnarsson, more commonly known as Red Brokk. We touched upon his history already. He was a brilliant engineer out of Barrack, often considered to be the single best one there, and he was the victim of a failed assassination attempt by Tordrek. Having been attacked with the huge industrial-sized rivets, he should have died by any metric, but sheer force of will and hatred kept him alive. Nonetheless, even today, the huge rivets still adorn his head and chest, a monument to his rival's hatred. Since the attack, he's dedicated himself towards improving the Dwarven Navy, a task most dwarves have abandoned since they surpassed the egotistical High Elves already. But the thought of killing his would-be assassin has always stayed with him, and he wouldn't be happy until Hackhart is brought to justice, which would of course influence his campaign objective, locating Hackhart, getting into Zulgazar, and killing him. In battle, he would wield the same weapon that almost killed him, the steam-powered Rivet Claw, which would make him a fearsome melee fighter that could very literally pin down foes, making sure they couldn't escape. Most of his roster would, of course, be ripped straight from the Dwarven roster, but for new units, while he could pick existing options, I think a far more fun option is for CA to create the contraptions he's invented in the lore. Literally none of these have art assets or tabletop rules or any of that kind of stuff, but the names alone inspire amazing possibilities. First up is the Siege Bulker. It's a 12-engined behemoth designed to rip apart enemy ships and fortifications with ease. The Sea Cannon, it's a gyroscopically stabilized cannon that's immune to the effects of moving, so you can actually fire it on the move. And lastly, and perhaps most excitingly to me, the Chasm Crawler. It's a bathyscaphe flanked with so many legs that it can get up close to the enemy and rip them to pieces using those same legs. Like, could you even imagine how the art would look for some of those things? His ship, Grimnir's Thunder, is actually his second ship, because his first one was mercilessly destroyed by the Black Kraken. This colossal war vessel has a litany of rapid-firing cannons, but is primarily designed as an aircraft carrier. These could both be easily represented by having his cannons fire more times and more frequently than standard ships, while additionally having the option to deploy a squad of gyrocopters or dirigibles, depending on whether or not this comes out after Mikason, once per battle. Alright, continuing with the awesome options, Amanhotep the Intolerant is the current ruler of Zandri, the port city near Hemri in Nehikara. An ancient ruler of Nehikara, Amenhotep's run-in with humanity doesn't actually start with the current events, but actually rather back in Bretonnia, who mistakenly took his mummified body back to their own country, only for him to wake up halfway through and kill them all just so he could return back home to his sarcophagus. I already empathize with this character. I too would murder a city just to go back to sleep. Later on, Jaego Roth, seeking funds for his revenge quest against Noctilus, raids the town of Zandri and some of its tombs before fleeing the angry Tomb King defenders. While Jaego does actually technically escape with the riches, Amenhotep immediately begins planning his retribution. He brings in the single strongest warbark in the entire navy and begins taking down the defiled tombs to improve upon it further. The Curse of Zandri was already a magnificent and terrifying sight to behold, but now features 4 Necrolith Colossi defenders, the hooded Necrosphinx of Zandri bound to its stern, and the massive Jewel of the River Mortis, a sapphire said to have come directly from the sun god Betraw himself. After construction of the massive war vessel, Amenehetum traveled directly to the Galleon's graveyard to strike up an agreement with Noctilus. The latter would operate openly to act as bait for Jaego Roth, which the former would use to kill Noctilus's attempted assailant. His campaign would then involve him hunting down his stolen treasures before hunting down Jaego Roth himself. In battle, he would play fairly similar to a standard Tomb King, wielding a pair of curved swords in battle against any infantry foolish enough to challenge him. As you might expect, his forces would be Tomb Kings through and through, of which there's still a surprising amount of nautically themed ones to pick from, but we're just going to go ahead and say thanks to Ajamuk for doing all the legwork for us. The Corsair Legion effectively act like Tomb King pirates already, and they wield a pair of Corsairs to murder infantry targets with ease. The Tomb Corsairs, on the other hand, are another pirate infantry, but this time wield large breaching axes to punch through armored targets instead. Lastly, the Bone Splitter artillery platform would be exactly what it sounds like, an artillery platform that launches little shards of bones at any infantry unfortunate enough to leave themselves exposed. The Curse of Zandri would prominently feature the Jewel of the River Mortis as its primary attack, offering up a huge damaging laser beam similar to the engine of the gods from the Lizardmen, but just cranked up to 11. It would possess only a single use per battle, but would be devastatingly powerful with each use. Its other ability would be to launch a battery of Screaming Skull projectiles at any infantry caught clumping up. Alright, we discussed Amanhotep, now let's take a look at his target, Jaego Roth. His story is one of tragedy, which I suppose is quite appropriate for a Games Workshop character. He was the son of a famous cartographer in Sartosa named Indigio, and enjoyed listening to his tales of far-off adventures, swashbuckling, and escaping danger. But his father's final story, one featuring a ship's graveyard and a terrifying vampire pirate lord, always seemed to scare his father as he told it, and his mind eventually began to deteriorate not long after telling the story. Jaego couldn't stand to see his once brilliant father slowly lose his mind to senility, so he left home as soon as he was able to, becoming a pirate just like his father before him. Commanding the Night Watch, he soon earned a name for himself, just as his father had, with numerous successes within his first year of command. Still, after years of piracy, he longed to return home to Sartosa to his wife and child, but when he arrived, he found the pirate city was on fire and half destroyed, a victim of Count Noctilus's now legendary Dread Fleet. When he located his father's ship, the Enlightenment, he found his entire family had all been killed by the vampire pirate his father had warned everyone about, with his father's corpse still clutching 3 artifacts: an Eldritch Moondial, a complete sea chart hidden within a shell, and an Arabian spyglass. After burying his fallen family, he swore revenge on Noctilus, and actually ended up stealing the Helden Hammer from the Grand Theologist and robbing Zandri to hire a crew, thinking little of the consequences. His campaign would, understandably, be about hunting down and killing Noctilus forever. In combat, he would play like a conventional pirate should be, an anti-infantry lord with some abilities to quickly escape unfavorable matchups. His roster would obviously come from the Empire, with a few new additions starting with admirals, duelists who would offer no leadership bonuses to their troops. A hero unit in the form of sea captains would act as a ranged skirmisher to harass enemy characters with. Seamen would act as tier 1 damage dealers, able to rack up real quick kill counts against other tier 1 infantry, but making Skaven slaves look durable in comparison. Marines, in comparison, would actually represent damage-dealing infantry, but up at tier 2 and a lot hardier than what the seamen would be in comparison. Cadets would be our last addition, a fairly low model count tier 3 infantry designed to hunt down high-value targets such as characters. The Helden Hammer, his flagship, could launch a barrage for the 180 cannons adorning it, providing a huge overkill zone to a large area, which could harm both friend and foe alike. Its other option could be a Blessing of Sigmar, generated from its Grand Templars, which could heal but not revive every troop map-wide once per battle. Commander Siegfried Schmidt could also be added in as a tech tree unlocked lord option. There are some other named characters, but I didn't think any of them really fitted his particular campaign. Alright, so last month I promised you Undead Skaven, and I stand by my promise. Meet Skretch Half-Dead. He was once a powerful warlord with Clan Scurvy, a clan on the Council of 13, and the one who controls the largest clan fleet in the entire Skaven kingdom. Skretch gained his reign through incredible backstabbing, the kind of backstabbing that even other Skaven would consider to be a bit much. Maintaining that position also took the kind of foresight and manipulation that would make Siege giddy with joy. Skretch was also thoroughly addicted to Warpstone, and it was that lust for the material that would eventually lead him to the Galleon's graveyard and to his initial death. As he neared the graveyard, he assumed he'd found a huge stash as the great green glow lit up the ocean. Once he got close enough, though, he realized too late he'd been baited by a massive orb leviathan, a huge monster of the deep, several times larger than any of the vessels under Skretch's command. While the fleet unloaded on the beast, even the Skaven's incredible technology could do nothing to stop the onslaught, and the beast destroyed every single ship, with Skretch's being bit clean in half as the very final casualty. However, because of how large the beast was, most Skaven were actually swallowed whole and thus completely unharmed within its gullet. Ironically, while the Skaven's weapons couldn't do anything to pierce its hide, once they were inside, they set about stabbing and consuming it from the inside no problem until it eventually died, with the Skaven still stuck within. As its corpse washed up on the shores of the Galleon's graveyard, Count Noctilus sought to raise it from the dead, and he did, along with all the dead Skaven within it. They immediately turned on Noctilus, putting a screaming bell on top to ward off his necromantic control, and mounting the warp cannons from their former warships to the outside of the beast. Ironically, they did so well that Noctilus was actually forced to a parley, and offered more warpstone than Skretch had ever seen, just so long as he joined Noctilus's force. Skretch and his undead crew agreed, but were always planning to betray Noctilus the first time it was beneficial to them. They set off on Scarbrus, the rotting orb leviathan, now bristling with Skaven technology, luring ships to their demise with the screaming bell, ironically fulfilling the same predatory role the hulking monster itself one did with its orb. Skretch's campaign would be pretty obvious. He wants his mountain of warpstone, same as he was promised. His quest would eventually lead him to an island made of warpstone and to a final quest battle, wherein Noctilus would fight to ensure he didn't gain control of the location. In combat, he would play as a dedicated ranged combatant, being almost entirely worthless in close quarters, but using a warpstone flintlock at range. His army would be almost entirely Skaven as you'd expect rather than zombies, and while I'm not expecting CA to completely reskin all the units, I have no problem with it looking the same as Skaven, they should have at least some differences. As for units, there's plenty of GW stuff left in, so why not let CA have some fun and come up with some nautical-themed Skaven instead. Skaven captains and fleet masters were both referenced in Thinkwell's series, and I for one would love to see a bunch of chittering rat pirates as character options for this specific army. Chow rats could also be made effectively to act like zombie deckhands with pistols, but with quicker speed and worse leadership. Lastly, a Dracoleech could be a really cool addition for all Vampire Coast to use, and it would apply wonderfully to our other pick within this lineup. His ship, the Scabrous, could be called on in battle to use its massive screaming bell, causing fear map-wide on every single Skaven once per battle, while its huge warp cannons could be used as a simple bombardment skill instead. As for unique characters, Clan Scurvy actually still has 3 that could be used as tech unlocks. Lynch Blacktail, Wheezy Gutgnaw, and Vesket Iron Scratch would all be melee characters, though the latter would have to be a lord in order to be even remotely lore appropriate. The cool thing is all of this work being done could make for an easy addition of Clan Ricket, Clan Sleekit, and Clan Scuttle as, minor factions that could be used to flesh out the campaign experience for all characters. For Skretch's other half, we look to Yrellian, a prince of Ulthuan and the firstborn of Finubar the Seafarer. Like most of the Grand Alliance, his story is not a happy one. Having been trained from a young age at naval tactics, along with his younger brother Bellalar the Golden, he was brilliant at most tasks he was assigned to, but frequently turned to war as the solution to most problems, something other leaders saw as problematic, his father among them. He put him in the Sea Guard of Lothern, where Yrellian excelled, and then sent him to train with the Swordmasters of Hoeth, where once again, Yrellian proved himself an equal to those who possessed even centuries worth of experience. Eventually, Finubar placed him in command of the Sea Drake, Finubar's own personal flagship and the most impressive vessel in all of Ulthuan, in the hopes that it would teach his firstborn the value of patience rather than brash violence. Yrellian thrived in such an environment, learning dragon speaking and quickly forming a fast bond with a drake named Simiel. But unfortunately, Yrellian never did adapt as his father had hoped and remained foolhardy and hot-blooded, which would eventually cause his fall from grace. At the Dark Elves' hold of Bleak Crags, Yrellian studied his adversary and found them well entrenched, but not unassailable. Sending a dozen mounted dragons, his younger brother being among them, his victory was assumed to be inevitable, as they had the element of surprise, powerful dragons, and outnumbered their foe by double. The Dark Elves were definitely losing on the naval front and retreated, leaving Bleak Crag wide open for a landfall invasion to stop and regroup at. But Yrellian shunted the advice of the more experienced captains and warriors, and instead commanded his fleet to chase down the retreating Dark Elves. What Yrellian may have realized had he heeded the advice and slowed down to analyze his foe is that they were collecting black dragon eggs, and when the High Elves eventually caught their prey, the Dark Elves unleashed the already hatched black dragon's breath, taking down the remaining dragons and Yrellian's younger brother with them. As he was about to fall into the sea, a colossal leech worm swallowed him whole to Yrellian's horror. While his fleet assailed the beast and eventually killed it, they couldn't retrieve Bellalor, and the creature's corpse drifted off during the battle against the surviving Dark Elves. After the battle, Yrellian read into the legend of how all dead creatures eventually end up at Galleon's graveyard, and told his crew they would not return to Ulthuan without Bellalor, or at the very least his body. For his campaign, I would make it so Yrellian quite literally cannot go back to Ulthuan, or it will automatically fail his quest. Also fairly obvious would be a natural state of at war with Loki or Felheart. He would obviously be searching for his brother, and I could see that going one of two ways. Either a nice ending of going, killing Noctilus and the raised Draco Leech in the quest battle, see, I told you I had a plan for that, and recovering Bellalor, or they could go super grimdark about it and instead have Bellalor be a raised enemy by Noctilus in the end, and have force Yrellian to kill his now undead brother in addition to a raised Draco Leech in the quest battle. In combat, Yrellian would be a duelist in the extreme, with some minor magical talent in there as well. He would eventually get Simiel as a Sun Dragon mount option in the end too, because let's be honest, CA loves mounts. His army would of course be High Elves, with some additions in the form of Lothern Sea Helms. They're a hero in the tabletop, but I would suggest instead that we move them to a Lord slot here, and they'd be decked out with a spear for anti-large up close, along with a bow for plinking enemies at range. Merworms would be a high-tier single-entity monster with Aquatic, who could easily obliterate enemy infantry squads. The Lothern Sea Cutter, a phenomenally stupid-looking thing, could be added in as an aerial skirmisher, as well as a mount option for the aforementioned Sea Helms. In battle, the Sea Drake could launch precision bombardments against enemy characters, with a short-duration Dragon Summon being able to quickly turn the tide of battle when used. Alright, so that's the entirety of the Dreadfleet and Grand Alliance character list, but if you stuck it out this far in the video, I do have some extra characters for you, ones that are quite a bit less well known. I'm not always going to have a pair available for all of these ones as a heads up, but I'll do my best to try and keep the theme of one good, one bad rivalry for each of them, at least where it's appropriate to do so. When possible, I am also going to include units for the picks, but do understand that some of these characters from here on out might have to be free LC options without units, and I'll denote that tag for any of them where that's appropriate. That's enough asterisks though, let's continue on, starting with Kap'n Skabend. So, Kap'n Skabend is a goblin pirate king and the current leader of the River Rats. The River Rats are a small crew but are infamous among the Greenskins and are frequently hired out to perform raids or takedowns at other vessels at sea. Frequently raiding the Empire's shores and the barges therein, Skabend was stopped at one time by Grimm Grunnson, and during the duel between the two, Skabend managed to take out Grunson's eye before losing his hand to the counterattack. Since then, the two have remained bitter rivals with one another, each planning their ultimate revenge when possible. Among the various contracts that the River Rats have taken, the most famous one was actually a hit on Joseph Bugman, a part of Git Guzzler's plan to eventually take over the brewery. While his attack against Bugman's barge was ultimately unsuccessful, it did force Joseph Bugman to accelerate away, which factored in beautifully into Git Guzzler's ultimate plans. Here, Skabend and Grunnson met again during the battle, with Skabend being prevented from killing Bugman by Grunnson, but with the dwarf losing his ship once again in the battle. Skabend's campaign would play vaguely similar to Clan Eshin, with contracts being offered against a litany of targets and you having the option to pick and choose which one appeals to you the most, building your infamy with each successful contract and losing your infamy for each failed attempt. Once you get to a high enough state of infamy, Git Guzzler would contact you for a final strike against Bugman, where you would find yourself as part of a 2 versus 2 quest battle, where you need to ensure Joseph Bugman doesn't escape the battle alive, and also ensuring that you take out Grunnson once and for all. In battle, Skabend wields a flintlock pistol in addition to his hooked hand, making him somewhat of a ranged duelist hybrid. His parrot squeak, Skreek, would have his own skill tree line wherein he could afford Skabend increased missile resist, melee defense, leadership, and eventually have a bound skill to annoy enemy characters, lowering their melee defense and attack for a short while. His roster would play like a pre-8 peak Skarsnik, in that you're always going to aim for goblins, not orcs. For added units, he would have Troglodytes, likely a tier 2 or 3 javelin thrower with the aquatic trait, anti-large and poisonous, while still being fairly decent in melee as well. Goblin pirates would be tier 1 goblin hybrid units, akin to zombie deckhands with pistols, but just living instead of dead. Lastly, gob launches and harpoon chuckas could be used, with the former effectively being an explosive damage version of the Doom Diver catapult, and the latter effectively being a spear chucker that could have a slowing effect against the target. He could also have access to Sliget, a dedicated support hero who would wield the red banner to boost the leadership of all friendlies nearby, with the sole exception of Skabend himself, who would actually receive a leadership malus. His vessel, Skabend's attack raft, could launch a bombardment of gob launches, giving a weaker but more precise bombardment ability, as well as having a summon for goblin pirates. Once again, this is the kind of addition that could very easily be used to flesh out other armies on the world map, such as the Blueface tribe. Alright, 5 teeth if you can figure out who his rival would be. That's right, it would of course be Grimm Grunnson, the dwarf bargeman. His story starts in Barrack Var, but he was very soon kicked out of the nautical engineering capital of the dwarves. Publicly, it was due to his desire to build wooden ships, rather than making the proper metal contracts the dwarves knew to be superior, but privately, his addiction to drinking engine oil strained the already thin patience of the guild past its breaking point. From there, Grunnson ended up as a boatman for the Empire, working on the Seahawk, a barge comprised solely of dwarven boatmen. The Seahawk would eventually find itself in the crosshairs of Kap'n Skabend, however, who sunk the vessel and killed the crew, save for Grunnson himself, who was instead only maimed, but survived. Since then, though, Grunnson has wanted nothing more than to track down Skabend and put him down for good, and started a crew of his own known as the Sea Dogs. They were eventually hired by Joseph Bugman to protect him and his cargo, wherein, of course, Grunnson met the River Rats head-on, with both crews fighting furiously to emerge victorious. While he lost his ship, Grunnson didn't die, but his current whereabouts is left a mystery, which works out perfectly for us since it lets us combine some dwarven pirate elements together that we might not have otherwise been able to. I would have CA take his story and have him seek out other dwarf pirates to help him in his revenge, such as Longdrawn, Kazrak Sharkbiter, and Aldar Morningstone, giving him a campaign experience somewhat similar to Marcus Wolfhart. In battle, he would be a dedicated range combatant with a pistol giving him skirmish abilities and a telescope item that, when unlocked, could give him a surprisingly long range bonus with sight. For new units, firstly he would have the Sea Slayers. These would be slayers with the aquatic trait, pistols, and a penalty to leadership for any troops near them, friend or foe alike. Dwarf shipmasters would be an aquatic dwarf with swords and a couple bombardment abilities, and of course being a lord option. Sea Engineers would be a hero option, which would effectively act like an aquatic version of Dwarf Engineers, a dedicated ranged hero who provides bonuses to dwarven technological units such as artillery and cannons. Breaker cannons would be one of those new technological pieces, being weaker in power compared to the standard field cannon, but be able to be hauled into battle far more quickly. The Dwarf Gatling cannon would be an absolutely devastating anti-infantry platform, but would chew through its ammunition reserves extremely fast, making it a hit hard, hit early kind of gambit. Each of the named characters would also have their own unique ship, in my eyes, but that could be a bit too much of a demand for CA, so for this particular entry we're going to leave it to CA to figure out how this particular one should be done. Alright, Aislinn is a pick I'm sure some of you will no doubt recognize. He's a pretty famous high elf, and even my own fairly small channel has brought him up on more than one occasion. Aislinn is met with trepidation by most other high elves, as his excessive use of violence gives him more in common with the Druki than it does any of his own kin. Aislinn wanted to rid Ulthuan of Norscan raids forever, and decided that the best way to do that would be just to head on up to Norska and burn every city to the ground. As such, there's numerous instances of the Lothern Sea Guard showing up at a city, razing it down to cinders and ash, and then silently leaving veiled by the mists. Even this would have been somewhat forgivable, but it was during a hunt for a pirate who had robbed Sardaneth that Aislinn crossed a line that effectively ostracized him for the courts forever. While chasing down the aforementioned pirate, Aislinn thought nothing of invading the city of Marienburg, nor in any of the collateral damage he caused during the chase. This effectively devolved into a small-scale war within the city itself, and almost ended up pitting the High Elves and Empire into a war with each other. It was only through Finubar's interference that Aislinn wasn't tried for war crimes by the Asur. A few years later, and still Aislinn had learned nothing of his impetuous mistakes, and attacked the Blessed Dread, the Black Ark of Lokir Felhart. This foolish attack cost him the entire fleet and his own ship. In a desperate duel against Felhart, Aislinn mistook having knocked a single blade aside for an opportunity, and instead, Lokir stabbed him and threw him overboard for the mistake. 6 months later, however, Aislinn miraculously washed ashore in Atane, completely unharmed from his battle against Lokir, but bearing no memory of the fight. From here on out, he was labeled as the Herald of Athlan, because it was assumed only the god of the sea could have kept him alive after such an ordeal. This is where our lore for him effectively ends, As well, he does have some interesting tidbits in the end times. Well, I mean, frankly, they're not going to apply to Total Warhammer 2, or possibly even 3 in his particular case. Aislinn's campaign would involve getting revenge against Lothern Hackhart by collecting and returning his memories to himself, with those memories being returned by recreating his past victories against the Norskins, before eventually finding himself in a 3-way battle against Lothern Hackhart and Valbrand Fireblade. His roster would obviously be plucked from the High Elves, but I would suggest going back to the Sea Elf lore that GW used to have, because it would be super easy to justify given Aislinn's connection to B'thlan. His ship, the Mist Maiden, would have a map-wide ability that could temporarily give his troops a huge missile resistance, and a single bolt thrower bombardment ability that could wreak havoc on single-entity monsters. Alright, we're going back to 2nd edition. Man, GW had some cool lore back then. For Aislinn's rival, with Valbrand Fireblade, leader of the Dragon Fleet and the only specifically named Chaos Navy character. Yes, in a faction renowned for taking longships and raiding the other factions of the world, no one else but Valbrand here was considered important enough to toss into that specific category. Valbrand leads a band of Greyling slavers and is infamous for how good he is at it. While the Greyling themselves aren't actually in the Vortex map, that's not a problem, as he's renowned for dealing with the Druki for selling off his excess slaves, so moving his start position elsewhere is incredibly easy to justify. In spite of the fact that the Greyling could be added in as a brand new faction for Game 2, I would actually make him his own specific, unique faction, because of how incredibly far off the Norskin lore is from when Valbrand was created. You see, rather than worshipping a chaos god, Valbrand actually worships a daemon prince instead, Surthrond. He's a half-giant, half-dragon daemon prince of Khorne, and Surthrond was so impressed by Valbrand and his worship, he actually ended up giving him a flaming sword as a token of his patronage. On its own, that might not sound all that impressive, but it clearly is to the Norskins back here, because when Valbrand shows the sword to any of his tribesmen, he always has flocks of warriors come to his side as a result. How I would put him into the game is restrict him to only have legendary lord options available, and with him having quests to unlock each of those. So our first legendary lord option would be Hildir. She would be a female reaver and an extremely proficient duelist. In the middle of battle, she is renowned for calling out her opponent for single combat. Of course, since no one wants to look like a sissy for declining a lady's challenge, they almost always end up realizing too late that their pride's about to cost them their life. She's also abnormal in the sense that she's marked by chaos, but instead elects to forego the gifts of any god, so she'd slot right into Valbrand's merry brand of murderers. Her quest to unlock could be as simple as finding her on the map and defeating her in combat, thus earning her respect and having her join your forces. Our next killer queen hails from Sarl and is someone I've actually mentioned before on this channel, Birna. Just like Hildir, she's also marked by the gods, though worships none of them, making her a perfect fit for Valbrand. She's a shield maiden, meaning an axe and shield user, blessed with the tongue of crows, allowing her to communicate with blackbirds, which would likely involve giving her a bound spell or two of bird-related spells. For her unlock condition, Birna was known to actually have been captured by the Beastmen and was about to be sacrificed before being saved, so to unlock her it could be as simple as finding a quest battle where the Beastmen are about to sacrifice her and killing them within an allotted amount of time. The last one I'd put in would be Einar Sigdenson of the Bearsenlings, whose family tribe was completely wiped out save for Einar himself by the Acelings. He'd be more of a tank than a true duelist, being described as a giant even by Norskin standards and having a ton of heavy equipment. Collecting him would be as simple as finding a row of an Aisling army, defeating it in battle, after which of course Einar would respect you and join your forces. Collecting all 3 additional legendary lords would give Valbrand a theoretical cap of 4 armies to work with, which would help him in his quest against Aislinn to get revenge on the High Elf for the loss of all the Norskin settlements. For new units, there is a metric ton of old Norskin options to pick from, to the point where the fact that the current Norskins are just essentially warriors of chaos is just super depressing to me. It's such a waste of potential. Anyways, what I mean by this though is that additional content would not be an issue in any way, shape, or form. Just as with the dwarf from before, I would give each of the legendary lords their own ship and let CA just have fun with them. El Cadavo is a name you might recognize from the Southern Realms mods, and his story is actually quite interesting. He started out as a particularly cruel and savage merchant, wherein he burned down the orchards and fields of a rival just to drive them out of business, before monopolizing that market and establishing a trade route along the Badlands. Eventually, this wasn't enough to satiate his greed, nor save him from the ever-growing resentment of his neighbors, so El Cadavo made for Lustria, where he assumed he could bribe the local lizardmen with cheap trinkets. When that failed, however, he assumed he could just threaten them with cannons, when the lizardmen counter-threatened by blocking out the goddamn sun. Learning precisely nothing from the encounter, he made a base of operations a stone's throw away from Hexawatl, and spent the next 30 years annoying Mazdamundi and having a settlement burned to the ground each time for his efforts. On the third attempt, Mazdamundi actually fully awoke from his slumber to finally kill this annoying Warmblood once and for all. Crushing most of the defenders before they could even prepare, Mazdamundi then caused the tectonic plates to shift and quake, destroying the entire city down to the last stone and crushing any survivors. Well, all but one survivor, El Cadavo himself, who had retreated to the sea to avoid retribution. In-game, El Cadavo would be pretty easy to toss in, having great relations with Marcus Wolfheart and numerous areas he could put in that would be considered lore accurate. His objective would remain the same thing it was the first 3 times he tried and failed, to invade Hexawatl and steal the treasures of the Obsidian Tower, with the added desire now of killing Mazdamundi for the numerous defeats at the ancient hands. In battle, he would rock a sword and board and would eventually have the option to take a mount. Despite being a melee fighter, I'd actually give him below average leadership and a bad leadership bonus to show off the fact that he's a bit cowardly and somewhat crass with the lives of his men. His roster would be entirely Empire, or Southern Realms if they're added in by then, and he could justify being added in with the rest of the pirate roster on his side. Boatmen would be quick, aquatic tier 1 infantry, of a slightly substandard bias compared to other basic troops. River Wardens would be a tier 2 anti-large unit, once again with aquatic. Footpads and cutthroats would both be damage dealers who use stock to get close to high value targets before taking them down. His ship, unlike every other one on this list, I wouldn't give any special activated abilities. Instead, I would give it campaign-wide passive effects such as bonus income and ambush defense. I guess while we're dealing with humans, we can add another one into the mix, this being Priestess Elsa Udermar. She's, again, from way back in 2nd edition. Starting to notice a theme here. Anyways, Elsa's story actually starts with a completely different name, Elmer. You see, that's the name she had to pick to avoid being ousted as a female among her Sartosan crew, who would not have tolerated her presence had they known any better. After a buggered up raid and an interrogation by the Imperial Navy, she was ousted as a female, and true to form, her shipmates immediately turned upon her, proclaiming that they only raided and pillaged due to Elsa being a witch who had tricked them into it. The Imperial officer, also staying true to character in the sense that he was completely useless, believed their story and had her walk the plank in the middle of the sea. She somehow still survived this fall and continued surviving thanks to a plank of wood that she was clinging to and a mysterious albatross who kept her fed by constantly bringing her fish to eat. She realized that this must have been Manon's doing, so once ashore, she immediately made her way to a temple of Manon and joined their ranks, becoming a priestess of Manon. Since then, she has taken command of a ship, the Vengeance of Manon, and now seeks the crew that once sold her out. Her quest then is literally spelled out for us. Find the little bastards who threw us under the bus and throw them over the ship. For her campaign, I could see her leading a band of seaborn. These are folks who were born at sea and refused to touch shore as a result. As such, you could give her a kind of Nakai-like a campaign experience, where cities that you've taken are handed over to Camille Defina of the Cult of Manon, with separate blessings available if you dedicate it to the Cultists of the Dyke, Believers of Olivald, or the Veneration of Angus the Black. Simple enough then. In battle, she would be a mage character using Lore of the Deep, something none of the other named humans on this list would have access to. For new units, she could start with the Order of the Albatross, who would effectively be priests of Manon in all but name, and would wield the Lore of the Deep just as Elsa does. She would also gain access to the Dragon Turtle. Yes, I'm grabbing a unit from 1st edition to use on our 2nd edition Lord in an 8th edition army roster. The Dragon Turtle would be slow, as a turtle would expect it to be, but be armored all to hell and back, and would be a pretty much dedicated anti-infantry monster, as well as potentially a mount option if CA so chooses it. Sea Elementals could also be another cool addition. These are taken from the old Man of War rule set, and would be monsters with a couple bound spells from the Lore of the Deep. Other easy additions would be the Sons of Manon. These would be tier 2 sword and shield infantry, as well as the Knights Mariner, who would be tier 3 infantry along with a cavalry equivalent. Lastly, the Storm Guard would be tier 4 unbreakable anti-large units, but would have very little in the way of protection as they're only wearing robes and wield a trident. Her ship, the Vengeance of Manon, could provide a spell giving a global ward save to troops and map wide, as well as a couple bound instances of Tide Call. As for tech tree options, there's a surprising amount of Manon cultists left, with a whopping 4 named characters who make perfect sense as unlocks: Hrothgar Halfdane, Abir Walblatt, Rolf Waterbreather, and Egbert Hubers. Alright, we had one really cool Tomb King earlier, but I'm sure many of you had already heard of Amanhotep the Intolerant. King Amenehetum, on the other hand, is a name I'm sure many of you are unfamiliar with. They would distinctly be a free LC lord, but a pretty fun one. In life, Amenehetum... Okay, we're going to change that name right now. I'm not doing that for this whole entry. From here on out, they're going by Amen. Amen had a grand old time conquering far-off lands and sailings, all while preaching the name of the vulture god Ulatep. He made Xandri a very rich city due to his efforts, and Xandri remains the richest Tomb King city even to this day, so he definitely made a lasting impact. He was assumed lost at sea at some point, but given Nagash's great spell, it's now assumed that he continues to help out Xandri by taking out any pirates that could threaten the city. Amen would almost assuredly be a free LC, not a DLC, but he'd be a very easy one to justify. Put him in the game and have him hunt down anyone who dares to steal from Xandri. Kind of like the Book of Grudges, I guess, on steroids. This would, rather obviously, also give him a very similar as Amanhotep, but I don't get the impression he'd be too happy to work alongside a known vampire like Noctilus, so I'd say there's definitely room to give him his own story as opposed to just following Amenhotep's story. Alright, a second edition pick now, and a very literal Vampire Coast edition, is Nanosh. Nanosh's story is one of complete and total manipulative brilliance. The captain of the ship Unturnhamung... Jesus Christ, GW, get your crap together. Unturnhamung. Captain Schluter hired 2 Stragani men despite the objections of his men and the superstitious crew. The Stragani were hard workers and seemed as happy in the ocean as a fish, so the captain took them aboard and left port, transporting grains, soil, and roots. 3 weeks into the ocean, however, all the food for the ship had rotted out, and the crew knew it wouldn't be long until they starved to death. The Stragani led the mutiny that had the captain, and those loyal to him, rounded up, cooked, and eaten. Still, a few bodies wouldn't tide them out forever, and they were still weeks away from the shore. More and more crew were selected as sacrifices to be eaten, but each time the crew seemed to grow a little bit hungrier and a little bit easier to influence. Once they had all completely lost their mind, Nanosh emerged from his coffin in the soil, completely in control of the now ghoulified crew aboard the Unturnhamung. The Unturnhamung now sails around the world raiding cities in the dead of night to drag victims back to the ship to the crew to consume. Nanosh's campaign would, logically, feature the food mechanic of the Skaven, and would probably involve trying to take over the pirate city of Sartosa or Ajajil after a failed attempt earlier. His army would be a hybrid of the Vampire Counts and Vampire Coast, with a huge emphasis being given on ghouls. Given the relative lack of current Strigoi units, Nanosh would logically only be a free LC option, unless CA really wanted to have some fun and create some ghoul and Strigani pirates for him to use. Alright, so there was obviously more named characters than this, and maybe you're wondering why your one got left off the list. So I'll go through them and hit them all one by one. Lord Savarik I left off due to the fact that he is no longer listed as a pirate, he was only a pirate once upon a time. Captain Drekla due to the fact that he would distinctly be a legendary hero for Luther Harkin, not a lord unto himself. Al-Khaldi Nasreen due to the fact that he both lacks most lore as well as the fact he seems to be more of a city-state operator. Camille Dufina due to the fact that she is clearly a political leader and never leaves her city. Hilaria Klimt, oh Jesus Christ, that's a mouthful, due to not having anything to do with gameplay related stuff, she only has lore related stuff. And Micah the Bloody due to the fact that he lacks too much relevant information, including even what he is, we don't know. The rest of the Felhearts I also left off due to the fact that Lokir still exists and kind of overshadows most of them. Anyways, I want to apologize for the excessive length of this one. There was more preparation and research done for this particular video than for any other video I have ever done on this channel, and you didn't even get to see all of it. I actually had pre-done entries for Micah the Bloodied and Lythakir Felheart, but I didn't want to make you sit through an hour-long video. I'm going to take a break from these remaining Lord series for a few weeks, and I'll instead touch upon some other categories of topics I'd like to discuss for a little while, just so I can continue preparing for the next batch of these. If you've made it this far into the video, I want to give you a sincere thank you for sticking it out this long. As always, thanks for hanging out with me, and I hope to see you all soon.